The wagon wheel screamed a metal song against the rutted dirt, a sound almost drowned out by the town's laughter. They called her a ghost, sent to a man they swore was a beast. Her name was Maeve, just Maeve, a name like a whisper of a prayer she no longer remembered how to say. She was a debt paid in flesh and bone, a piece of human property handed over to the town's queen of venom, old Mrs. Thatcher. And Mrs. Thatcher, with her soul as puckered as her face, had cooked up a cruel game. The game was simple. Send the disgraced woman, the fever orphan, the town's silent shame, up the mountain to him, to Caleb, the man they only spoke of in hushed, fearful jokes. They called him a monster, a hermit grown huge and twisted in his grief, a beast who lived in a cave of his own sorrow. And the final nasty punchline to this joke? Maeve's job, her one humiliating task. She was to bathe the fat mountain man, to scrub the years of grime and grief from a creature they all agreed was less than human. Maeve's knuckles were bone white, where she clutched the thin sack holding everything she owned. She'd survived worse than their laughter. She'd survived the silence after the sickness took her ma and pa. She'd survived the gnawing hunger that turned your insides to knots. She'd survived the kind of cold that felt like it was freezing you from the bone marrow out. Their scorn was just another wind, and she'd learned long ago how to turn her face away from the wind. The wagon lurched to a stop at the bottom of a path you could barely see, choked with weeds and shadows. The driver didn't even look at her. He just tipped the back of the wagon and let her slide out like a sack of unwanted grain. Then he was gone, and the silence that fell wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was absolute. Up ahead, she could see it. The cabin. It wasn't a home. It was a wound made of stone and shadow, hunched against the mountain like it was trying to hide from the sky. It was a fortress built not to keep people out, but to keep grief in. And standing in the doorway, a figure carved from the dying light, was him, Caleb. The first thing she saw in a single, gut-punching instant was that the town was a liar. He wasn't fat. He was built of the same hard stuff as the mountain itself, broad, powerful, a man made of rock and earth. But it was his stillness that stole the air from her lungs, a stillness so deep it seemed to swallow sound, to drink the light. His eyes were sunk deep in a face carved with a pain that was too old for his years, and those eyes, they held nothing for her. No welcome, no anger, just a vast, terrifying emptiness. He didn't speak, not a single word. He just lifted a hand, not to greet her, but to point. A single, sharp gesture toward a small, dark room off the main one. That was to be hers. Then he moved to a dusty table and placed a single coin on its surface. It was old, tarnished, a cold, clear message. This was a transaction. She was not a guest. She was a service. Purchased, paid for. The heavy door swung shut, and she was alone in a silence that felt heavier than any stone she had ever lifted. She was in the beast's den, and the beast had just locked the door. For the first day, Maeve moved like smoke through the house, a silent question mark in a place that had forgotten what questions were. The air itself was thick, heavy with the dust of a life that had simply stopped. Every table, every chair, every inch of floor was covered in a fine gray powder, a burial shroud thrown over a world that had died. Caleb was a predator at the edges of her sight, a shadow in a darkened doorway, a presence she could feel on the back of her neck. He never spoke to her. He never told her what to do. He just watched. His face was a mask of stone, unreadable, his eyes holding that same desolate emptiness. He was waiting. But for what? For her to run? For her to scream? For her to fulfill her part of the town's cruel bargain? She didn't know. And the not knowing was a terror all its own. She decided not to start with the scrubbing. That was their game, not hers. Instead, she started by listening. She listened to the house itself, the way the floorboards groaned under her feet like an old man in pain, the way the wind clawed at the window panes, a dry whispering sound, like a secret being told by a dying man. She listened to the profound, aching silence where a woman's laugh should have been, where a child's running footsteps should have echoed. It was a silence full of ghosts. She found them, piece by piece, a chipped clay mug with a faded blue flower painted on it, a woman's sewing basket tucked away in a corner, a silver thimble still nestled in the thread, and in the darkest corner of the main room, a small hand-carved rocking horse, with one of its rockers snapped clean in two. These weren't just things. They were artifacts, the last remnants of a life that had been buried alive. She didn't touch them. Not yet. It felt like trespassing on a grave. Instead, she did the one thing she could. She walked to the heavy shutters, the ones nailed tight against the world, and she pulled. The wood groaned in protest, old nails shrieking, but she pulled with all the strength she had left in her thin frame. And then it gave. A single brilliant spear of afternoon sun cut through the gloom. It lit up a million tiny dust motes, making them dance in the air like tiny frantic spirits. And for the first time since she'd arrived, the room seemed to take a breath. She found a broom, its bristles worn down to almost nothing, and she began to sweep. The rhythmic shush of the broom against the floor was the only sound, a quiet, steady defiance. Later, in the cold, dead hearth, she found a small sack of flour and a handful of dried beans. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She built a fire. The first crackle of the wood catching flame was a gunshot in the stillness, a shock to the heart of the house. Soon a smell began to fill the cold, dead air. The smell of baking bread. Simple, honest, warm. It was the smell of life, and in this tomb of sorrow, it felt like a revolution. He appeared in the kitchen doorway then, his massive frame blocking out the light. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the simple, rising loaf of bread. And in the desolate emptiness of his gaze, for the first time, something flickered. A ghost of a memory, a stab of an old forgotten pain, a warmth he had long since buried. He still said nothing, but when she took the bread from the hearth and placed it on the table between them, he didn't turn away. He sat, and they ate, together, in a silence that was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken language of shared bread, a silent truce in a war she was just beginning to understand. The silence was still there, but now it tasted of hope. In the days that followed, the house began to change. It was a slow, unwilling transformation, like a man waking from a long and terrible dream. Maeve was a quiet storm of reclamation. The windows, once filmed over with years of grime, were now clear, letting the pale mountain sun spill onto the floorboards. The floors themselves were swept clean, and the stale, dead air was slowly being replaced by the scent of wood smoke and the wild herbs she gathered from the mountainside. She worked without being told, letting a deep, quiet instinct guide her hands. She found a small garden plot behind the cabin, a tangled mess of thorns and weeds. Patiently, day by day, she began to clear it, her hands turning over the cold, sleeping earth. She was planting seeds for a spring she wasn't even sure she would be there to see. But it was an act of faith, and faith was all she had. Caleb remained a creature of the shadows, his routines as fixed as the stars. He'd leave at dawn, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, and return at dusk, a pair of rabbits or a wild turkey slung over his shoulder. He would leave the day's hunt on the porch, a silent offering, and then retreat back into the fortress of himself. But something was shifting. A crack was forming in the stone. He no longer watched her with that flat, cold suspicion. Now there was a weary curiosity in his gaze. He watched the way her small, neat stitches mended a tear in his flannel shirt. He saw the single, defiant wildflower she placed in a chipped jar on the windowsill. These were small, gentle acts of creation, acts of life, and in the world of death he had built for himself, they were as loud as a scream. One afternoon, she was clearing a high, dusty shelf when her fingers brushed against it. A door, but not a door for a person. It was a small, square door, no bigger than a bread box, set right into the stone of the chimney. It had a small, rusted iron lock. It was the only thing in the whole house that felt deliberately sealed away. Forbidden. It was cold to the touch, a deep, unnatural cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She didn't try to open it. She understood that some doors are locked for a reason, that some griefs are too big to be disturbed by a stranger. She respected its secrets. Her real discovery came later that night. In her own small cold room, a floorboard felt loose under her foot. She pried it up with her fingertips. And there, tucked into the dark space beneath, was a small, worn rag doll with mismatched buttons for eyes. It was crudely made, the stitching uneven, but it had been loved. Loved until it was falling apart. She held the small doll in her hand, its button eyes staring up at her blankly. And in that moment, she finally understood. The crushing silence in this house wasn't just his. It wasn't the silence of one man's grief. It was a shared silence, a duet of sorrow. There was another soul in this house, a smaller one, a ghost hiding in the cracks of this terrible, immense grief. And suddenly, the beast in the other room seemed infinitely more tragic and infinitely more dangerous. The child appeared as silently as the first winter frost. Her name was Lily, a whisper of a girl with her father's haunted, solemn eyes and a stillness that wasn't peaceful. It was the stillness of a cornered animal, a deep, learned fear that had become a part of her skin. For days, Maeve had only seen her in flashes, a flicker of movement down a dark hallway, a small, pale face peering from behind a half-open door, vanishing the second Maeve turned her head. It was like trying to catch a glimpse of a fawn in the deep woods. Maeve never pushed. She never called out to the phantom child. She just started leaving things. A small piece of her cornbread on the stone hearth each evening. A cup of fresh goat's milk on the floor by the little girl's bedroom door. She would hum quiet, forgotten tunes as she worked, weaving a gentle net of safety and patience, hoping the little ghost would eventually drift into it. Then one morning, it happened. Maeve was sitting on the porch step, mending an old woolen blanket, the rising sun warming her back. The little girl approached. She moved without a sound, her bare feet making no impression on the dusty porch. In her small, outstretched hand, she held a gift. It was a bird carved from a single piece of pine, its wings rough and uneven. It was an almost perfect copy of the broken rocking horse inside. An offering. The one thing of beauty she had to give. Maeve took the small wooden bird with a reverence that felt like a prayer. The simple act of acceptance seemed to make the little girl's shoulders, which were always hunched up to her ears, relax by a fraction. "For you," Lily whispered. Her voice was rusty, cracked from disuse. It was the first time a voice other than the howling wind had dared to speak in this house of silence. And it was the voice of a child. That small wooden bird became a bridge across the chasm of their grief. Lily began to orbit Maeve, a tiny, silent moon drawn into the gravity of her quiet warmth. She would watch, her eyes wide and serious, as Maeve cooked, her small hands mimicking the kneading of dough on the tabletop. She would follow her out to the garden, her tiny fingers gently, tentatively, touching the new green shoots that were pushing their way through the dark earth. The house, once a tomb, began to fill with small, hesitant sounds. The soft patter of Lily's bare feet on the wooden floors, the sound of her humming, a mirror of Maeve's own quiet tunes, and eventually the occasional, whispered question, "Why is the sky blue? Do rabbits get lonely?" Caleb watched this fragile alliance form from his usual fortress of silence. But his face was no longer a mask of stone. It was a landscape of warring emotions. Pain, hope, fear. He saw his daughter, the girl who had been a silent ghost in her own home ever since the fire, slowly, cautiously, unfurling like a flower that had been trapped in ice. He saw the life returning to her cheeks, the curiosity returning to her eyes, and he didn't know what to do with the fierce, protective gratitude that was warring with the deep, bitter grief in his heart. One evening, Maeve was tucking the worn blanket around the sleeping child on her small cot. Lily's eyes fluttered open, but she wasn't looking at Maeve. Her gaze was fixed on the dark corner where her father sat, a massive, unmoving shadow. "Can you ask the sun to come back in Papa's eyes?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. The question, so simple, so innocent, landed in the silent room like a boulder thrown through a glass window. It struck both adults with its devastating, heartbreaking clarity. Maeve's heart cracked, and across the room in the shadows, she saw the mountain of a man flinch, as if he'd been struck by a physical blow. The simple, whispered words of a child had just exposed the raw, gaping wound at the center of their lives. The storm came without a breath of warning, a sudden, furious explosion of wind and freezing rain that turned the mountain into a churning, gray nightmare. It was as if the storm that had been brewing inside the cabin had finally called its twin from the sky. For days the wind howled, a relentless, shrieking monster clawing at the stone walls, trying to get in. But inside, an even more dangerous storm was gathering its strength. Caleb had been caught out in it. He'd been checking his trap lines when the sky opened up, and he'd come home soaked to the bone, his body racked with a deep, violent shuddering. At first he ignored it. His stubborn, mountain pride was a shield he used against any sign of weakness. He was Caleb, the beast of the mountain. He didn't get sick. But by the second day, the fever had him. It took hold with a terrifying speed, its heat a malevolent fire in the freezing cabin. He lay on his cot, his breathing shallow and ragged, his skin radiating a dry, burning heat that Maeve could feel from across the room. He was a mountain being consumed by an internal fire. The deep, jagged scar on his forearm, an old burn Maeve had noticed before, was now an angry, inflamed red, the angry mouth of the poison that was spreading through him. Lily was terrified. She huddled by the hearth, her small face pale with a fear that was clearly not new. She had seen this kind of fire before. She looked at Maeve, her huge, solemn eyes filled with a desperate, silent plea that screamed louder than the wind outside. And Maeve knew. This was the moment, the crucible. The town's cruel, twisted joke was about to become a desperate life-or-death necessity. The fever was climbing, a relentless tide of heat. Caleb had begun to murmur, his mind lost in a delirium of smoke and shadow. His huge frame, once a symbol of unbreakable strength, now looked fragile, vulnerable. To break this fever, she had to cool his body. She had to peel away the sweat-soaked layers of flannel and denim that were trapping the heat against his skin. She had to see what he had kept hidden from the world beneath his armor. It was a violation, a crossing of a boundary that felt as sacred and dangerous as that small, locked box in the wall. But Lily's terrified eyes gave her no choice. Survival had its own rules, and it demanded an intimacy that had never been offered. Maeve moved with a grim, steady purpose that she didn't feel. Her hands worked on their own, heating water, gathering clean rags, while a cold knot of fear coiled in her stomach. Lily watched her, a small, silent shadow, her face a mask of old trauma. "Papa is strong," Maeve said, her own voice a low, calming anchor in the howling storm of her own fear. "We will help him." She approached the cot. Caleb's eyes were glassy, unfocused, lost in a past she couldn't see. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing if he could even hear her. Gently, her fingers trembling, she began to unbutton his shirt. The fabric was damp and hot, clinging to his skin. As she peeled it back, she braced herself. She braced for the sight the town had so crudely whispered about. But there was no fat. There was only ruin. Her breath caught in her throat. A sound, half gasp, half sob, escaped her lips. What she saw was not a body. It was a testament to fire and agony. The entire left side of his torso, from his shoulder all the way down to his hip, was a brutal, terrifying landscape of scar tissue. The skin was a melted, twisted tapestry of angry pinks and ghostly whites, pulled taut and puckered in some places, eerily smooth and shiny in others. It was not the body of a man who had grown soft and lazy in his isolation. It was the body of a man who had thrown himself in front of the flames. He hadn't just been in a fire. He had been a shield. In that one horrifying instant, the entire story of this broken man rearranged itself in her mind. The silence, the isolation, the haunted, empty eyes, the little girl who was terrified of fire. It all snapped into place, a picture so devastatingly clear it almost brought her to her knees. The town's mockery, their cruel jokes, their petty wager. It wasn't just cruel. It was a profound, unforgivable ignorance. They had laughed at his armor. They had mistaken the very proof of his sacrifice for a weakness. A wave of emotion, so powerful it felt like the storm outside had entered her own body, washed over Maeve. It wasn't pity. It was a deep, aching respect, and a fierce, protective anger that burned hotter than Caleb's fever. Her mission was no longer about a paid debt or a cruel joke. It was about tending to the wounds of a hero who had been forgotten and scorned by the very people he may have tried to save. Her hands, when she began to bathe him, were no longer hesitant. They were gentle. They were reverent. She was cleaning the map of his pain with a tenderness that was a prayer. She was bathing a giant, and she had never felt so small. For 2 days and 2 nights, Maeve did not sleep. She was a sentinel, a tireless guardian moving between the fire and the cot, fighting a war against the fever that threatened to consume the mountain man. The storm outside raged on, a perfect echo of the battle being fought inside the small cabin. She bathed his scarred torso with cool water, her touch impossibly gentle on the ruined skin. She coaxed warm broth between his cracked, dry lips. She spoke to him, her voice low and soothing, filling the barren room with the sound of a human voice that asked for nothing in return. She told him stories from her own childhood, simple tales of sunshine and running streams, trying to pull him back from the dark, smoky landscape where his mind was trapped. Lily never left her side. She was a small, brave shadow, her own fear pushed down by a desperate need to help. She fetched rags and cool water from the rain barrel, her small hands surprisingly steady. Her terror was slowly being replaced by a fragile, flickering hope, and it was all focused on Maeve. During the worst of it, Caleb cried out in his delirium, his powerful hands clenched into fists, his body arching off the cot in some remembered agony. He spoke a name, not a cry, but a single broken word torn from the deepest part of his soul. Anna. It was the name of the woman who had used the thimble in the sewing basket, the mother of the little girl with the button eyes, the ghost whose absence had hollowed out this house and this man until there was nothing left but a shell of grief. Maeve dipped a cloth in the cool water and placed it on his forehead, her own heart aching with a shared, bitter understanding. She had lost her family to a fever. He had lost his to a fire. They were both survivors of a terrible burning. They were citizens of the same desolate country. On the third morning, the world outside fell silent. The wind died down, and a watery, gray dawn light filtered through the clean windows, painting the room in shades of hope. Inside, the fever had broken. Caleb's breathing, once shallow and ragged, had deepened. It was even and calm. He was sleeping a true, healing sleep for the first time since Maeve had arrived. Exhausted, her bones aching, Maeve sat in a wooden chair by his side, just watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The simple rhythm was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. When he finally opened his eyes, they were clear. The fog of the fever was gone. The shadows of delirium had retreated. He looked at her, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw her sitting there, her face pale with exhaustion, her clothes rumpled, but her gaze steady and calm. He saw the basin of water on the floor beside her. He felt the cool dampness of the rags still resting on his skin. He knew. His gaze dropped, moving from her face down to his own scarred chest. He looked at the ruin of his own body, exposed and vulnerable. Then his eyes lifted back to hers. There was no shame in his gaze, only a raw, aching vulnerability. His eyes asked a silent question, a question he couldn't bring himself to speak. Maeve simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent answer. "I saw," it said, "and I am still here." In the quiet of that dawn, with the storm finally over, a new world began. A world built on a shared secret, a shared pain, and the simple unspoken promise of a woman who had seen a monster and refused to run. The first trip to town was a brutal necessity. The storm had wiped out their meager supplies, and Caleb, though still weak and moving like an old man, was determined to provide. A new kind of silence had settled between him and Maeve since the fever. It was no longer the silence of distance and suspicion. It was a silence of shared experience, of a deep and unspoken understanding that was stronger than any words. He had started looking at his daughter again, truly looking at her, and he saw the light, the life that was returning to her eyes. He owed that light to the quiet, stubborn woman who now walked beside him down the mountain path. When their small wagon rattled down the main street, the town stopped dead. People came out of their shops, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. It had been years since Caleb had shown his face in this town. And never, not once, with the ghost child some of them had forgotten even existed. But the real shock, the thing that made their jaws hang open, was Maeve. She was walking with them, not behind them like a servant, not with her head down like a disgraced woman, but beside them, a part of their silent, defiant procession. Mrs. Thatcher was standing on the porch of the general store, her arms crossed, her face a mask of sour disbelief. The cruel wager had been lost, and she was not a woman who took losing well. Well, well, she called out, her voice like nails on a chalkboard, loud enough for the whole town to hear. Look what the mountain coughed up. Did you finally manage to scrub the beast clean, girl? A few nervous, cruel chuckles followed her words. Maeve flinched, her shoulders tightening, the old shame washing over her. She expected Caleb to do what he had always done, to ignore it, to retreat back into the stone fortress of his silence. But he didn't. He stopped the wagon. He turned, not with the wild rage they had all expected, but with a cold, immense calm that was far more terrifying. He didn't even look at Mrs. Thatcher. Instead, he looked at Maeve. Then in a single, deliberate movement, he stepped down from the wagon and moved to stand slightly in front of her, a living shield, once more. He laid his large calloused hand on her shoulder. It was a simple, possessive, and profoundly public gesture. It was a claim. Then, and only then, did he raise his head and meet the old matriarch's gaze. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried the weight of the mountain behind it. It cut through the nervous silence of the street like a blade. She is with me, he said. Just 3 words, but they were a wall, a declaration, a final, unbreakable boundary drawn in the dirt of the main street. He then turned, helped Maeve down from the wagon, took Lily by the hand, and led them into the store, leaving the entire town standing in a stunned, gaping silence. He had not only faced their monster, he had claimed her. Inside the store, he bought flour and salt and beans, the necessities. But then he did something that made Maeve's heart stop. He pointed a long finger at a bolt of blue calico cloth, a bright, cheerful blue, the color of a clear summer sky full of impossible promises. He paid the shocked storekeeper for it and then laid the heavy, clean-smelling fabric in Maeve's arms. It wasn't a transaction. It wasn't payment. In the silent, echoing space of the general store, with the whole town watching through the windows, it was a promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. The seasons turned on the mountain. Each one felt like a quiet act of healing, washing away a little more of the sorrow that had stained the land and the people on it. The garden Maeve had tilled with her bare hands exploded with life. Green beans climbed toward the sun, and bright orange squash grew fat against the gray stone of the cabin. It was a defiant splash of color in a world that had been monochrome for too long. And there were new sounds, too. The sound of Lily's laughter, once as rare and shocking as a summer snow, became a frequent melody as she chased butterflies through the meadow, her bare feet flying. The house was changing. The locked wooden box in the wall was finally opened. Caleb did it one afternoon, using a small, ornate iron key that he took from a chain around his neck. Maeve had never noticed it before. Inside the box was not what she expected. There was a stack of letters tied with a faded silk ribbon, but underneath them was a small, leather-bound journal and a single tarnished silver ring, too small for a man's hand. He didn't read the letters to her, but he opened the journal. It was his wife's, Anna's. He let Maeve read the elegant, flowing script. He was sharing the artifacts of the life he had lost, not to burden her with his grief, but to finally share its weight. He was no longer a man made of just silence and stone. He was a man made of memory and survival, and now a fragile, burgeoning hope. Slowly, carefully, he was rebuilding his world, and he was making a space for her inside it, a space that was not just for a servant, but for a partner. He began to speak more. His words were still sparse like rare mountain flowers, but they were chosen with care. He taught Lily how to tell the difference between the call of a wren and a sparrow. He showed Maeve which roots in the forest were good for medicine and which ones were poison. He started to fix the things that had been broken for years. He mended the runner on the small wooden rocking horse, and the first time he saw Lily sitting on it, rocking back and forth with a small, contented smile on her face, Maeve saw his own lips curve into something that was almost a smile. It was a start. Maeve took the blue calico cloth, the color of promise, and in the quiet evenings by the firelight, she began to sew. Not with the quick, practical stitches of mending, but with small, careful stitches. She was making a dress. Each stitch was a small prayer of gratitude, a testament to the strange, unexpected turn her life had taken. The dress wasn't for a journey away from the mountain. It was for a life being built right here, on this patch of healed earth. She was no longer a ghost haunting someone else's home. She was its heart. Her quiet, resilient strength was the fire that kept it warm. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a home, filled with the smell of baking bread, the warmth of the hearth, and the soft murmuring sounds of their three lives weaving themselves together into a new and unexpected tapestry. A family. They were a strange and scarred little family, forged in the fires of a cruel joke and a raging fever. But for the first time in a very long time, they were whole. But the town below still held its secrets, and Mrs. Thatcher's venom had a long, long root. One evening in late summer, the world was painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun bled out across the peaks. The three of them sat on the porch, a quiet, comfortable unit. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. Lily was asleep in her father's lap, her small hand clutching the little wooden bird Maeve had kept safe for her. Maeve was sewing the last button onto the blue dress, her fingers moving with a quiet contentment she had never known. A comfortable silence enveloped them, a silence that was now a soft blanket, not a cold stone wall. Caleb looked at Maeve. He watched the way the fading light caught the strands of her hair, turning them to fire. He looked at her capable hands, the hands that had brought life back to his home and peace back to his heart. He had been a man entombed in his own grief. He truly believed his life had ended in the fire with Anna. He had thought his scarred body was a mark of his failure to save her, a monstrous testament to his loss. But this quiet, resilient woman had looked upon his ruin and had not seen a monster. She had seen a man. She had tended his wounds, both the ones on his skin and the deeper ones on his soul, with a grace that asked for nothing. She had shown him that survival was not the same thing as living. He reached out, his large calloused hand covering hers, stilling her needle. Her skin was warm against his. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His touch spoke of gratitude, of protection, of a future he had never believed he would have. Maeve looked up from her sewing, her gaze meeting his. In his eyes, she no longer saw the vast, desolate emptiness of the man she had first met. She saw the reflection of the sunset. She saw the quiet strength of the mountain, and for the first time she saw a clear and steady light that was all his own. The sun had come back to his eyes. They had earned this peace, a quiet harbor built from the wreckage of their past. But some storms don't end. They just wait. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of the town sheriff, a man named Gable, whose face always seemed to be apologizing for the words that came out of his mouth. He rode up the path one afternoon, his horse sweating, his face grim. "Caleb," he said, not getting off his horse, there's been some talk. Mrs. Thatcher is stirring up trouble. She's saying things about the fire, about Anna." Caleb's whole body went rigid. The stillness returned, but this time it was not empty. It was coiled, dangerous. "What things?" His voice was a low rumble. The sheriff shifted in his saddle, refusing to meet Caleb's gaze. "She's saying it wasn't an accident. She's saying you said it, to be free of Anna." The accusation hung in the clean mountain air, a poison, an obscenity. Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Caleb, at the man whose body was a map of that very fire, and saw a pain so profound it was like watching the mountain itself crack open. He didn't deny it. He didn't rage. He just turned and walked back into the cabin, the door closing with a sound of finality, shutting Maeve and the rest of the world out. The beast was back in his cave, but Maeve was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived on the wagon. She looked at the sheriff, her eyes blazing with a cold fire of their own. "He would never," she said, her voice shaking with a fury she didn't know she possessed. You tell her. You tell that venomous old woman that she is a liar." The sheriff just shook his head sadly. "Proof is a hard thing to fight, ma'am, and she claims to have it." That night the cabin was colder than it had ever been. The silence was back, but now it was a jagged, broken thing. Caleb sat by the cold hearth, a statue of grief, his face lost in shadows. Maeve knew that Mrs. Thatcher's lie was a knife, and it was twisting in a wound that had never truly healed. She had to do something. She went to the small wooden box, the one that held Anna's things. She lifted out the journal. Caleb didn't stop her. He didn't even seem to notice. She sat by the fire, lit a candle, and began to read. She read about Anna's love for Caleb, her joy in their small daughter, her dreams for their life on the mountain. But as she got closer to the end, the tone began to change. A shadow fell across the pages. Anna wrote of Mrs. Thatcher's strange jealousy. Mrs. Thatcher was her aunt, her mother's sister, and she had always been possessive, resentful of the love Anna had found with Caleb. "Aunt Elspeth visited today," one entry read. "She says I have shamed the family by marrying a man of the mountain, a man with no name. She says he will be my ruin. She looks at him with such hatred, it frightens me." Maeve's hands trembled. It wasn't proof, but it was a seed of a different story. The last entry was written on the day of the fire. The handwriting was rushed, frantic. "Elspeth was here again. We fought. She said if she couldn't have me back, no one would have me. She said she would see this house burn to the ground before she let him keep me. Caleb is out checking the far traps. I smell something, like kerosene, on the porch." Maeve stopped breathing. It was here. The truth, hidden in a dead woman's words. The fire wasn't an accident, and Caleb wasn't the monster. He was the victim. Mrs. Thatcher, in her twisted, obsessive rage, had set the fire that killed her own niece, and she had let this good, heroic man take the blame, live in the prison of the town's scorn, for years. Justice. The words screamed in Maeve's soul. She closed the journal and walked over to the silent man by the hearth. She placed her hand on his unscarred shoulder. "Caleb," she whispered, "it's time for them to know the truth." The next morning they rode down the mountain, not as a broken, silent family, but as an army of three. Caleb, Maeve, and Lily. Caleb held Anna's journal in his hand, his knuckles white. Maeve sat beside him, her spine straight, her face set like stone. They didn't stop at the edge of town. They rode right to the sheriff's office. Mrs. Thatcher was already there, spinning her web of lies, her face a mask of false grief and accusation. When she saw them walk in, a flicker of pure, triumphant hatred crossed her face. "Sheriff!" she screeched, pointing a bony finger at Caleb. "Arrest this man! This monster! He killed my niece! He burned her alive!" Sheriff Gable looked from her to Caleb, his face a mess of confusion and pity. Caleb didn't speak. He just held out the journal. "My wife's words, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and steady. "From the day she died." The sheriff took the journal. The room fell silent as he began to read. Maeve watched Mrs. Thatcher's face. The triumphant smirk began to waver. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped rat. The color drained from her cheeks. By the time the sheriff read the last, damning entry aloud, her face had collapsed into a mask of pure, ugly guilt. "It's a lie!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. The girl was hysterical. She was imagining things. But it was too late. The truth, once spoken, had a power all its own. The sheriff looked up from the journal, his eyes hard as stone, for the first time Maeve had ever seen. He looked at Mrs. Thatcher, not as the town matriarch, but as the monster she was. And in that moment, the entire town, which had gathered outside the office, saw it too. They saw the lie they had chosen to believe for years, and the innocent man they had condemned. Caleb stepped forward. He looked down at the sputtering, venomous woman who had stolen his life, his wife, his name. "You left my daughter an orphan," he said, his voice breaking with the grief of years. "You let me burn." And with that, the sheriff stepped forward and put his hand on Mrs. Thatcher's shoulder. The game was over. The cruelest joke had finally found its punchline, and it was justice. The ride back up the mountain was different. The air felt lighter. The sun seemed brighter. The silence in the wagon was not heavy, not sad, not even comfortable. It was peaceful. The town they left behind was in turmoil, forced to look at its own ugliness, its own willingness to believe in a monster rather than a hero. But that was their burden to bear now, not Caleb's. When they got back to the cabin, the home that had once been a tomb, Caleb took Maeve by the hand. He led her to the small garden, now bursting with life. He looked at her, and the sun was fully, blindingly back in his eyes. "You," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he still didn't have the words for. "You saved us." Maeve just shook her head. "We saved each other." That evening, Maeve put on the blue calico dress. It fit perfectly. It was the color of hope, of new beginnings. She came out onto the porch where Caleb and Lily were watching the last of the sunset. Lily's eyes went wide. "You look like a queen," she whispered in awe. Caleb just looked at her, and his smile, a real, true smile that reached his clear eyes, was all the answer she needed. They were a strange and scarred little family, forged in fire and lies, but they were finally, beautifully whole. Their story teaches us a powerful lesson about judging others. The town saw Caleb as a monster because of his scars and his silence, but they were blind to the truth. His appearance was a mark of incredible sacrifice and love. Maeve, who was also an outcast, was the only one who looked past the surface and saw the hero beneath. It reminds us that people's deepest pains and greatest strengths are often hidden from view. True compassion comes from looking beyond gossip and appearances to understand the heart of a person. We see how quiet acts of kindness like baking bread or mending a shirt can heal wounds that anger and violence never could. Maeve didn't change Caleb with force. She changed him with gentle, persistent care, showing that true strength is often found in quiet grace. Their story is a powerful reminder to always lead with empathy, because we never truly know the battles others are fighting. If this story of redemption and love touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspirational stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a new video that will warm your soul. Thank you for watching.